This is Kimberly Reuter, business advisor and supply chain expert, and welcome to my podcast, The Morning Mood. Today, we have a guest, John Westwood. John and I started working together with a shared client working on ocean freight processes and an ocean freight RFP. And we kind of clicked because we think about things the same way. We've also come up through the trenches in supply chain and ocean freight importing. And John has a really interesting background and an excellent life lesson that he wants to share with us today and how he has applied it to success. So, John, welcome.
Yeah, Kimberly, thanks for having me. As Kim said, John Westwood. So background is I've been navigating logistics for about the last 20 years, right?
Yeah.
Procurement, particularly really helping companies turn complexity into clarity.
Uh-huh.
Mainly been leading a lot of sourcing events across all the modes, ocean LTO, domestic, and really guiding shippers through kind of growth and disruption, especially disruption in the last few years.
Yeah.
And today, mainly what we focus on at Blue Spark is we're helping clients and brands, right, rethink their logistics strategies, up to around the ocean procurement, not just around cutting the cost, right? We're seeing a lot more about building resistance and that long-term value.
Yeah, exactly. So tell us a little bit more about your background. So how did you get to Blue Spark? Because you've worked for a couple of interesting companies and it's pretty fascinating how you kind of fell into supply chain. That's not where you started, right?
Yeah, I did go with the Penn State. It bounced around a couple of majors. Decided that I saw trucks and planes everywhere, and ended up in the logistics program eventually.
Okay.
Uh, Came out and actually worked at a couple of freight forwarders. So cut my teeth there back in the day when you used to have to do the bill of ladings and all that manually, and actually faxing back in the day for
Oh
the
yeah, yeah. We were just talking about this the other day. I started in the industry when sending telexes.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
yeah, one step more closer to the stone tablet. Yeah, way back when it was different. So you started as a freight forwarder. So were you doing like ship planning and stuff like that, but or just bill of lading, cutting, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I did it all. Worked for all but sort of the ground floor to managing some of the larger clients in chemical around there. So managing their ocean and air freight,
Oh
uh,
wow.
managing their process. So worked at a company in Philadelphia, kind of famous for working with Dow with DuPont. Eventually, we had a consulting company come in there and tell us a lot of things to make their process improvement. I was a little bit mouthy with the company, and we ended up getting hired by them, right? 'Cause I had a lot of pushback. So, went to go for some great mentors, and those companies eventually got bought up by Accenture.
Oh
In the
wow.
years, worked at Chainalytics, right? Again, so more focusing in on building out their international and also their benchmarking for domestic. It eventually led me to where I'm currently at, Blue Spark, which we manage about 349 clients, ocean procurement.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. So really deep background in ocean freight. You've almost always worked in the ocean freight industry.
Yeah, I think for a while I did domestic for a while. Kind of fell in love with the ocean in that it was less carriers, which means less RFPs, less contact.
Yeah.
And also thought there was a giant void in that industry. Didn't feel like there was a lot of specialty around that. Typically when I'm talking to someone, right, the ocean is, maybe a secondary job for them. You always have your
Yes.
person, right?
Yeah.
Knows it purple, knows their LTL, and there was sort of this, mythological presence around ocean, how the box gets there, but we don't understand how it gets there.
Yeah.
So working in there, felt there was a lot of room for improvement, and also, someone who likes to travel and get around, right? It was an easy way to kind of get some paid vacations, right?
Oh,
And
yeah, totally. Well, you can work that in. That definitely makes it worth it for sure. Excellent. So thanks for sharing your background with us. And you and I worked together. We worked on an RFP for a client, which was super interesting. And that this particular client, they didn't have a forecast. Do you remember this when we first started engaging with them? Like we were like, we think we know how many containers we need. It was this really weird sort of conversation in the very beginning.
yeah, it's probably one of the things you learn early is you think there are all these mechanisms in place for visibility and solutions. And even at the largest companies that we see, a lot of the basics are not there, right?
Yeah.
Well, forecasting rate is obviously key, right? You got to
Yeah.
know what you want to buy and when you want to buy it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So typically not unusual. I mean, I'm sure you see it all the
Me
time
too.
across here, and that was one of the big props that we had gotten was getting that forecast right, so we knew what to buy and how to source that correctly for the upcoming bid season.
Yeah, yeah. It was a big one. Yeah, and I'm surprised too that how many clients I walk into, big and small, old and young, and you're just like, wow, okay, we have not cracked this code yet. But that's what we get paid to do, so that's what we do. All right, so tell us, what is the biggest lesson you've learned to date? Obviously, we're always learning lessons, and how have you applied that to your success?
Yeah, yeah, thanks. We were talking a little bit about the procurement and how we work together in the background, right? And I thought one of the biggest kind of lessons I've learned and what I see across the various shippers is really mistaking routine for strategy, especially around procurement, right?
Yes.
No, why the conversation matters between you and I is like we're living in a time where it's more unpredictable, right? We have major
Right.
disruptions. We had these natural disasters. Now we have policy changes. These are all now the new norm, right? I think we're
Yep.
all there, right?
Yeah.
The thing that we're kind of talking about here, right, is that the idea that procurement happens once a year is on a
Yes.
calendar, it has a fixed mindset, right? You know, RFP is used to be a sacred event, right? We ran it this time of year in a contract for and we just aren't seeing that anymore, right? The market
Yeah.
would run on your calendar, right?
Yep.
It's really today, what is really running on, and I think you're in agreement, right? It's running on these pressure points, right?
Yes.
Right. We have port strikes last year, right? We
Yes.
have crazy demand swings, and then with the various administrations, right? We have those
Yep.
geopolitical um shockwaves, we'll call them, right? Up and down, right?
Yeah.
So to me, right, when we kind of run these annual bids, it's not really a strategy. It was sort of something you were resting on hope.
Yep.
Uh, and again, it's not real strategy if it's just organized, right? It's what
Yeah.
your strategy is what works under pressure,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And I think we're now seeing that mind shift from how do we save money once a year into how do we stay agile all year round, right? So
Yes.
that's really kind of where we're trying to focus on this. Hey, your routine of a once a year bid may be outdated, right?
Yes. You uh, touch on a couple of things there that's really interesting to me. And we see this not just in ocean freight and not just in business, we see this in life too. Companies do a rinse and repeat. They get success, and they're like, okay, this is what's working, and we're just gonna keep doing it over and over and over again. They don't revisit, they don't look and see what's going on in the market. And it's one thing that I've talked about a lot in the podcast and a lot when we look at big companies like Amazon who continue to grow and succeed, and that day one mentality, right? Like we don't know anything. So it's really interesting that you're touching on that, and that I see companies do this not just with their supply chain, but also with everything that they do. Like this is when we buy, this is how we buy. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what are right? So I think again, right, we're confusing structure with the strategy is what
Yep.
we're talking about here, right? And your procurement, right? If you're ignoring the market, right, then your strategy is just outdated by design. And what you're telling me here is right. These companies are always running on calendars,
Yep.
right? Performance, quarterly goals, or budgets, right? But the idea that the procurement again is once a year, it can
Yep.
hold.
Yep.
It's not fiction. But
Yeah.
companies work on this time, but time's the most precious thing. But it's not a real thing, right? Control doesn't come from tradition, right? It comes from
Right.
more the responsiveness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Responding to what's going on in the actual market. Yep.
And if
Yeah.
you're not responding, and you know this better than anyone, right? You're missing those critical opportunities, right? Of aligning like your internal cycle to how the external world is unsynced, right?
Yep.
You should align. Just because you won an RFP in March doesn't mean it's proper time. And
Yes.
a good point is the pandemic, right? We got paying $1,500 rates. They went up to 10,000. We had to pay $10,000 meager box from Asia to here. 3 weeks later, right, when it put some capacity and things get in it, the $10,000 rates went to $3,000, right? If we
Yeah.
were running the annual bid and we were stuck at those 10,000,
Yeah.
not that you would do that, but again, market helps dictate that,
Yeah.
right? And I think for you, right, it's like, is our obsession, right, with structure making us
Yep.
less strategic? I don't know if you see that across
Yes.
UBO, right? And maybe another way to say is like, do you think that companies are confusing like being organized as
Yes.
Ramby?
Yeah. Well, and so what I see, and it's very similar to what you're talking about, is the set it and forget it. The this is what we've always done, this is how we've always done it. And then there becomes this resistance to change, right? There
Yeah.
becomes this staunch, almost visceral reaction to doing something slightly different. And that is what holds companies back. Like this keeps coming up in a lot of my interviews that I've been doing, is that when the ego gets in the way, the leader stops learning, they stop having an open mind, they stop growing, the company stops growing. And I think that's what you're talking about too, is that if you're doing it the same way that you've been doing it for 10 years, because that's just the way you've been doing it, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing it right.
Yeah, could not agree more. And the other piece is right, and we're talking about procurement,
Mhm.
is it's really no longer about price, right? I think this is what you're kind of hinting on here, right?
Mhm.
Procurement to me, right, and it's really about it's a job. It's just no longer taking it out to spend.
Yes.
It's not about price control. It is really, and I've been trying to coin this term, so give me credit, all right? If it comes up, it's like risk management dressed up as a contract, right? And
Yes.
bulk large procurement professional has transformed from low cost to understanding the risk management, right? It's no
Yes.
longer for the lowest numbers, but it's about, what you try to do your blue spark is bring about the highest certainty, right? Because
Yep.
what are our super scared about? They want to get the freight on board, right? They need to have a product at launch time. They have a budget. A budget needs to align to what we are sourcing here, right? So again, it's not,
When we're sourcing it, yes.
and you've probably seen it where it's not so much about delivering the highest savings rate. It's
Yes.
about buying the most predictable services a lot of times, right?
Yeah. And yes, absolutely. The supply chain, the import supply chain, and I think, you would agree with this 8, 10 years ago, like, so pre-COVID, right? The import supply chain was really about lowest shipping, right? $1,500 TEUs. Like it was about how low can I get my shipping costs? COVID flipped that around because all of a sudden we had a lot of uncertainty and we've really never recovered from that. In addition to that, steamship lines got used to getting a lot of money, and we'll get into this in a later podcast when we can get deep into that. But supply chains shifted from how cheap can I get it to can I get it?
So have you seen then in your experience working on sea levels, have you seen more like a shift from savings to like survival?
Yeah, and so what I've seen is companies who have not adopted what you're talking about, which is
Right.
focusing on resilience versus this is how we've been doing it for 10 years and I know this is how it works. What I've seen is that companies who have not adapted, and just to get into a specific example that you and I ran into recently, is how ocean freight contracts have changed, right? We're moving away from multi-year set price contracts with mutually agreed PSSs. We're moving away from that and we're moving into these fluctuating variable pricing contracts and things that are negotiated more on a quarterly basis or annual basis, less long term. And so what I see are companies who have not adjusted to that and leaders who have not adjusted to that are reaching out in these panic moments, right? Where they're like, oh my God, what are we going to do? We can't get our cargo, right? We can't get any space. We can't get this. Like they're reacting to the market. And because of that, they're behind the 8 ball, is what I see.
Yeah, no, they're definitely behind the 8 ball. A lot of it comes to doing a lot of the pre-work too, right? Because we'll
Yes.
hear about this price, right? We're talking about profitability, right? And we're kind of getting to the point where we're saying, right, disruptions are greater than the cost of our quote unquote savings.
Yes.
It's about really kind of measuring your current performers and kind of understanding, who are my core carriers, right? When we are doing the RFP scoring, right, it's no longer like you said, hey, what's the lowest cost carrier in our worry, right? What
Yep.
was the work percentage? In
Yes.
all of the time, will this carrier be able to make my thing? What is their DI quality? What is their whole time performance, right?
Yeah.
It's,
How often do they cancel? Are they doing blank sailings constantly? Like, yes, yeah.
it's a lot more complex, right? Because really what we're trying to end up doing as the procurement professionals, right, is less firefighting, right?
Yes.
And I actually had someone tell me the other day, and I was perfectly kind of said, right, is the cheapest option also our most irresponsible option, right? And I was like,
Yes.
probably at this point, right? You want fewer rollover, we want better visibility, right? We don't want to buy the cheapest first option. Again, we want to have the most reliable option going forward.
Yeah. It's more about value, I would say now.
Yeah,
What
that's
is the
very
overall value?
right. Yeah. And I think we were talking a little more about the procurement in the valley and kind of piggyback what we're saying here, right, Grace? It's about value is also about recovering, right?
Yes.
Something wrong happens, how fast can we recover? And
Yes.
one of the shifts that I think we're seeing, especially now with the ocean, right? If you think about ocean, kind of where we're at here is we have less alliances, right? So we have less options. Things are moving at a different pace, right? The private equity model has finally gotten to these guys and they figured out how to turn capacity on and off, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to sit down and spend orders cons optimizing the supply chain, right? What's
Yep.
the local cost I could get, run these scenarios and these great systems, right? And I think what we're finally seeing here is something called like optionality over optimization.
Yes.
And we spent decades treating the supply chain, right? Like it's a physics problem.
Yes.
When it's really not, right? It's more like a living and breathing thing, right?
Yes.
And I know your thought is like you're kind of bouncing around this office. Matt has been a previous podcast up here, right? Matt told me he's like, are people confusing lean with like things being fragile? I know your thoughts on that, right?
Yeah.
Did we get to a point where we made it too lean and too fragile? We didn't have that flexibility, right?
Surplus in there, right? Yes. Yes. I would agree. And that's a really good point. I would say that people are confusing mean and just in time with fragile, poorly run supply chains. Yeah. That's a good point. Really good point.
Yeah, I think it's
Um,
okay to have a little bloat, right, nowadays in
yeah.
your supply chain, right? Kind of what separates kind of the reactive supply chains
Yep.
from or the resilient ones.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're seeing here, right? We're seeing carrier options, we're seeing routing options, East, West Coast,
Yep.
Gulf. We're seeing, so again, not so much lowest top carrier, not only splitting higher volumes by a few carriers, right? It is, hey, do we have different inland options? Can we transfer them? Do we have here, right? And so a lot of that is, in an era when like, we're seeing these blank sailings and weather shutdowns, I think we definitely see like the model shift again from optimizing it to perfection,
Yes.
to getting it pretty good to having us more options.
Yeah, for more optionality. Yeah, excellent. So great lesson that you shared with us and how you've applied it to the environment, the ocean freight and freight forwarding environment. Thank you very much for sharing and appreciate that. We hope to have you back to talk a little bit more deeply about ocean freight because as you have shown us, you are very experienced in the ocean freight space. So, any last lessons you want to leave us with today, John, before we sign off?
No, if you think we're good follow up, we can have is kind of we're doing a then and now, right? And I think looking at where you're at procurement wise versus where you could be, right? Kind of like from low cost carrier, but from cost from like a low cost to more of a risk manager, right?
Yeah.
On manual tracking to predicted tools, right?
Yes.
Which MQCs, right, to more of a flexible MQC.
Yeah.
Way. And then also, right, like again, redundancy is not a waste, right?
Yep.
Backup there's alternative lanes, inland recovery plans are all things that need to be, right? Plan B isn't optional anymore
Yep.
in both environment, especially around the ocean.
Yep.
So we double deep dive into those and how we help measure
Yes.
how we help the clients measure.
Yeah.
Uh and what do we do to kind of bring that extra value other than, optimizing your lanes on a low cost spreadsheet.
We're cheap as ocean freight rates. Yeah, you're gonna have to have a few more arrows in your quiver to be a successful supply chain professional these days, for sure. So, John, thank you very much for sharing. Looking forward to getting into those deep topics in our upcoming podcast. And you heard it right here from John. Don't set it and forget it. Just because it's what you've been doing for the last 5 years, it does not mean that it is actually a strategy.
Sure.
Thank you, John. All right. Thank you, my audience. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you, and we will talk tomorrow.